but here's how it will go. Okay, so welcome everyone. Just give it another minute. Jonathan, will you close that door? Just we have a couple extra people coming in. All right, so we are now on the parsha this week is Toldot, and we'll just start for. I'm going to pull this up in um, for us. Give me 1 second. Okay. Um, uh, Sorry, I picked the wrong chapter. Um, okay, here we go. What? Oh, here we go. Okay, here we are. So it starts.
Rabbi, you doing Parsha first?
Oh, am I mixed up in my classes? Oh,
You
sorry.
are mixed up. So dread.
Uh, oh, good. Yes. All right. So forgive me. Thank you for okay for reminding me. Okay, here we go. All right, we are now on the 39 melachot. So let me just renew my share. Okay, thanks for the okay, 39 malachot. Okay, here we are. We are looking at the 39 malachot of Shabbos. We are last week we did a sort of an overview of what the basics of Shabbat was. We talked about um, the idea of the fact that the Shabbat is this very interesting way in which we emulate Hashem, and that we do not engage in any kind of creative work. And so that is the sort of fundamental basis of Shabbat. We also added to that some of the philosophical layers. The philosophical layers of that being that the that um, Abraham Joshua Heschel said, well, you know what? This is all based on the Mishkan, on the tabernacle, and the tabernacle is a sanctuary in space, and the purpose of Shabbat is to create a sanctuary in time, so that the rabbis used the 39 categories of creative labor used to make the Mishkan to define what transformative work would be vis-a-vis Shabbat. Now, there are, as I pointed out last week, there's this wonderful book, which is called the 39 Malachot. I've sort of put it here as from some of our screenshots, and that this book is quite good at sort of helping us to understand these malachot. I think the best place for us to start is with the first malacha, which is choresh, plowing. And as I mentioned last week, the Shabbat begins with this. The first 11 transformative acts are the transformative acts of the making of bread. Um, I'm gonna, Jonathan, I will give you the physical book, so because you can't see my screen. Okay, perfect. Now, the this particular author, what's very interesting about this particular book, as I said, I love this book because it gives things in very graphic form, but you'll notice that first of all, it has footnotes. The footnotes are in Hebrew, and then he'll show you, if you see right here, he tells you, oh, this thing is called a psik resha. Um, and so it's a sophisticated book that also it's kind of good for all ages, in my sort of humble opinion, because it has both the sort of the pictorial virtue, but also is quite serious in its ability. So the rabbis are also quite clear on the fact that bread is not born in the aisles of Safeway. nor is it born in the baker's oven. That really, this is something that there's a lot of transformation that is required to get to bread. And so the book starts where the Talmud will start. That the idea it's choresh is plowing, and plowing is not just taking a beast of burden and putting a plow on it and dragging the plow through the earth, but it is broadly, it is preparing the ground for planting. So here, you can get the primary version of that is turning the soil, right? That turning the soil to allow the seed to fall into the ground is going to be considered a prohibition of choresh, plowing. And you see, they put this in this particular version. They put this little Torah symbol here. Kind of love that. They put it here because they want you to know that that it is a Torah prohibition. So in Shabbos, there are two different kinds of prohibitions. There's some which are going to be Torah prohibitions, and there are others which are going to be rabbinic prohibitions. So when you see on this particular one, when you see a little Torah sign, that just means that was a full Torah prohibition. And this makes sense that turning the soil is a Torah prohibition. I don't think that surprises any of us. Now, here's just an example of a rabbinic prohibition. Rabbinic prohibition is that sweeping or leveling on the earth is a rabbinic prohibition. So here you say playing marbles. Well, when you're playing marbles, your primary goal is not planting. That's not the problem. However, you might try and clear the field for a proper game of marbles. This only obtains when you're talking about something which is a plantable surface. This does not obtain if you're talking about, let's say, a paved surface, just because that's outdoors. But this is a very good example of there's certain kinds of activities which we're afraid will lead to the violation of Shabbat, and so they're prohibited. So playing marbles, playing some kind of ball sport is actually prohibited. Now you may say to yourself, wait a minute, Rabbi, you're telling me that there is a discussion about playing ball in the Talmud? And so I can't say that there's a discussion about playing ball in the Babylonian text of the Talmud. However, I can tell you that the Tosafot have a discussion about an early form of tennis. Wait, what is a French for tennis? Anybody know? French speakers here? What's Spanish for tennis?
Tennis.
Tennis. In the Talmud, it's called, in the Tosafot call it paluta. Hold on. Tenez. Okay. All right. So I guess it is not the modern word for tennis, but there was some racket sport that was played in the 11th century in court, that the Baalei HaTosfot, the Baalei HaTosfot are essentially Franco-Germanic rabbis who lived in the time period just after the Crusades. They are the grandchildren of Rashi, and they discuss, are you allowed to play ball on Shabbat? And one of the concerns is you shouldn't play it on an outdoor surface. However, as we all know, there are many different surfaces for tennis, and you actually are allowed to play it on Yom Tov. So, but perhaps we'll get to that full discussion in another scenario. Now, here we see a couple of other activities which are going to be prohibited. And these are not things, I know that most of us on Shabbat, we are rather, how should we say it? We are manicured hands Jews, not calloused hands Jews, by and large. So, I mean, some people, I know there are a number of people in the congregation who are master gardeners and, may have certain things that they're going to do in gardening, but you cannot dig a hole on Shabbat, because anybody who's put has bought a rosemary plant or a basil plant and decided they wanted to put it in their garden, well, you got to dig a hole first before you put that into the ground. Another part of this is fertilizing. That's another part of it. And I, as well, um, here's another very common thing that might happen is someone brings you flowers for Shabbat. They come to your Shabbat dinner and they bring you flowers. Guess what? You cannot place those flowers into water. You can say thank you very much and take the bouquet. Um, Similarly, the science experiment putting a raw potato into water is not um, is a problematic. Now, the truth of the matter is we are now coming a little bit more into they put a nice little green fence here because um, the next part of the Sidura de Pat, the advancement to making bread is Zorea. Zorea means to plant. And so all of these things are versions of planting, like putting the flowers into water, if you throw your pits on the water. And here's another one, which is very important one, which is watering your plants, right? You cannot pour water in plants inside or outside. You cannot prune things on Shabbat. And you should not put, as you can see, the watermelon seeds, you cannot throw those onto the ground because they may eventually grow to something like this. Now, here's an interesting question, right? So they have a nice little picture here of this gentleman. Let's say you have an outdoor picnic in the backyard on the picnic table for your Shabbat meal. And you decide, okay, well, we're going to have people wash, and you want to have people wash over the dirt. That's a problem. You cannot do that. Even though your intent is to wash your hands for Netilat Yadayim, you are still washing over plants, and you are going to cause them to grow. Now, here's a very common Vancouver scenario. I don't know if everybody on this is a Vancouverite. I know my mother's on here. So this happens less in Baltimore, but it can happen in Vancouver. Let's say you are in Vancouver and you walk home from shul, and it's one of those very rainy days, and you have a hat with a brim. And sometimes the hats with the brim, they collect water on them. I know this from personal experience, and you tip your hat to the left or to the right, and the water falls off the brim, right? And sometimes it might fall off the brim onto the water, right? Or maybe you're in some kind of a situation. You're outside, it's pouring, and you have and the the water is running off of you onto the ground. Is that a problem?
According to the Torah, yeah.
Are you sure?
Well, I mean, if you're not allowed to shake yourself off in your yard, because you might like get a plant to grow, and Vancouver is verdant with green grass and all sorts of other wonderful things on in our space. Sure, it's going to grow.
So the halacha actually is in this case somewhat result oriented. If if it's raining that hard, then on a 20-minute walk you have an inch of water on the brim of your hat, then you're not watering anything. It is already saturated. And so if you happen to spill water over something that is already a puddle, that is already a fully wet substance, then you haven't done anything. And that's actually permitted. Because it is the halacha in this case is interested in the result of what's going on. Now that doesn't obtain in every single situation, but in this particular one, when the ground is already wet and saturated, or the water is flowing into a puddle, that already you're not doing extra watering to the ground, there's no prohibition against that particular scenario. Now, let's get to harvesting as we're marching through our malachot. Harvesting is a much more serious prohibition. And the reason that harvesting is a much more serious prohibition is because it's really actually a lot more fun to interact with plants when harvesting is a possibility. Now that, for example, is climbing trees. Climbing trees on Shabbat is a forbidden activity because we are afraid that you might come to break off a branch, um, and that would be a problem. Similarly, you're not supposed to um, move a plant. Let's say you have a plant that now there is a difference between a potted plant with a hole and a potted plant without a hole. Generally speaking, certainly here moving a flower pot with holes, that's considered attached to the ground. Even if the roots do not have not yet penetrated, that is still considered legally attached to the ground. And so if you remove that flower, you are removing something from the ground. Um, Similarly, I don't know, I don't know if honeysuckle grows here in Vancouver. It certainly grew in Baltimore when I was growing up. So you're not allowed to pull honeysuckle off of the branch. You are not, if let's say you go by someone's rose garden, you're not allowed to smell the roses. You're not allowed to smell fruit that's attached to the tree. Now, all of I just want to point out here that we have a difference between that which is that which is rabbinically prohibited and that which is biblically prohibited. So, biblically prohibited, obviously, this guy who's sawing off the branches for firewood, that's going to be a biblical prohibition. That is called kotzer. That is reaping, right? Obviously, the person picking wheat, if you're picking fruit, picking grapes, you're picking oranges, whatever that malacha is, you're not allowed to do that on Shabbat because that really is harvesting. Now, downgrading a level, there are pieces of this um, that are going to be a rabbinic prohibition. So, a rabbinic prohibition is if you pull a flower out of a flower pot without holes. So that's going to be rabbinic because, again, that's not really attached to the ground anymore. But it's similar enough to picking a fruit which is attached to the ground. So that's going to be a rabbinic prohibition. But we even have rabbinic prohibitions which are even more remote, which you'll see is smelling a fruit which is attached, which you might come to pick. Um, is is something which you're not meant to do because that could actually bring you to the prohibition, the Torah prohibition of picking fruit. And I think I mentioned this last week that one of these things which is prohibited is riding a horse, right? And it's not riding the horse per se. Let's say you're riding within a private domain. The problem with riding within a private domain is that apparently people who ride horses, they're often going to strike the horse and that striking of the horse is is something which is likely to get them to pull a branch off a tree. Now,
That's the problem with riding a horse.
yes, that is the problem exactly. Now,
What is it? What's the problem?
when you
On
ride
a private domain or public, any place. What's the problem? I'm not
that
objecting. I just don't know.
that you let's just say you're riding past a willow tree and you need something to hit the horse with. So you're going to grab a willow branch and you're going to use it to hit your horse. That's the problem. The problem is it's in this section of kotzer, which is reaping, because we're afraid you're going to break the branch off the tree in order to hit the horse.
And if there are no trees, you're out in the desert, you're out in the plains someplace.
So,
You still don't do it because there might be a tree up the road yonder.
okay, so Sam of Arabia, where there are no trees, you and your horse, galloping through the desert. Still, this is something which the rabbis called a low plug. That they made a blanket rule, and I'll give you an example of why this is brilliant. And forgive me for the sectarian malice. Okay, so let's say you say, look, all right, we know that driving to shul is a problem. But the fact that we live in suburbia now, people live far away from synagogue. People in Vancouver, they can't afford to live in Shaughnessy. So Nebuch, they bought a house in Surrey, but we don't want them to be detached from the shul. So we say, okay, look, you're allowed to drive to shul on Shabbat, right? And I heard this from the mouth of a conservative rabbi. I think it's Daniel Gordis, the famous Zionist writer. Some people may subscribe to him. So he said he's a conservative rabbi. He's an ordained conservative rabbi. And I heard him say the conservative movement knows that it made a mistake. What was the mistake of the conservative movement? That it allowed driving to shul on Shabbos. Because people don't make a distinction between driving to shul on Shabbos and driving to Costco on Shabbos. And so what happened was they said you're allowed to drive to shul on Shabbos, and it ended up everyone drove to Costco also. And so they realized that it was a mistake. So this idea that rules have to be firm without exceptions, it obtains even though the and even though the it might be that nowadays, right, if you learn to ride a horse, you know, they sell, a $70 switch that you use to ride your horse, and you have something very fancy and nobody grabs the branches anymore, it's still a problem. And so we do not this is not an issue. Now, there are
Thank
some there are some things which are permitted and are quite subtle in this scenario. I just want to show you the permitted. So this little symbol over here is how the book shows us permitted. When you see one of those little fingers, right? Those are often that finger, by the way, is not invented by this book. It happens to be one of the symbols that you find in especially halacha books to show you that there is a novelty here. There's something that might not just be part of the regular, um, things you already know. There's something new to see here. So that finger in this one says you there's a leniency. So you would think, all right, if you're not allowed to climb a tree, and one of the other things which is prohibited is you can't put a swing on a tree, then wait a minute. Why can't I put a hammock on a tree, right? The hammock on the tree seems to be permitted. Now, the reason the hammock on the tree is permitted is because you'll see that as he's drawn it very carefully, there are two hooks for the hammock. So the hammock is one layer removed from the tree because of this external hardware, right? So that may seem like a subtle piece of business there, and you may have, if you've been in charge, you may have made the this issue a little different, but such it is that you are allowed to sit on a hammock that, as long as the hammock itself, if the hammock was tied to the tree, like the swing, then we'd be in a different story. But because the hammock is attached via some other um, um, some other device, that makes it permissible.
Now,
Okay?
but Rabbi,
Yes.
we're assuming, of course, that the hooks and the hammock are already on the tree Erev Shabbos before we
Yeah.
get started.
Well, no. The
Why?
hook, yes. The hammock, not necessarily. Right?
Well, no, you're saying right. I got a look
Okay.
on my face.
So I'm just telling you that I don't believe that the once you have the hooks that are firmly established on the tree, you can then hang the hammock on it because that is now one layer removed from the tree. So I don't think so I'm just saying I don't think that that's a hard fast rule. I think that you are allowed to um, put the hammock out there at that time. Okay. Again, quite a subtle rule. Um, okay. Now we come to the next little piece of the picture, and it is called me'amer. Me'amer is bundling, gathering. When I was taught it, I was told bundling because the way that they in Talmudic times they used to produce wheat is the first thing you would do is you would gather the wheat up into mounds, and um, that by the way, if you follow the Joseph story, One of Joseph's dreams is about one of these sort of big piles. So they would gather things in. So gathering fruit is also a problem. Now, you may have come here and said, okay, wait a minute, I'm not allowed to pick fruit from a tree. But okay, what if the fruit falls from the tree on Shabbat, right? Am I allowed to pick up the fruit that has fallen from the tree? Well, there are actually a couple of different problems with that. Number one is that there's a what we call a muktzah problem. The fruit which just falls from the tree has has a number of prohibitions attached to it because it wasn't prepared beforehand for Shabbat. We haven't gotten into muktzah yet. Muktzah means that which is set aside. It is outside the envelope of Shabbos, and since it's outside the envelope of Shabbos, we haven't designated for Shabbos, then it's going to be a problem. Here again, the prohibition is gathering up various different kinds of fruit and or produce and bringing them together. Okay, so this is the prohibition of me'amer. Again, this is not something which you encounter often, but if you're one of those people who has a garden and one of those people who has especially fruit trees where the fruits are falling and may fall on Shabbat, then you just have to not interact with the fruit at all on Shabbat. Okay, so that's sort of bringing us closer. Now, um, here, Dush, there's going to be a lot of things in Dush that we're going to have to deal with. They didn't deal with all of them. But the pictures do help us do that. Now, and interesting. Okay. So I love this picture because this sort of tells you how in the ancient world, this is how they did threshing. I have a feeling they didn't feed the animals beforehand because I'm just want to make sure Bessie didn't do her business as she's pulling this particular sled around. But these sleds, the farmer would stand on top of the sled, and the animal would pull it by, and the kernels would be ejected off of the wheat stalk. And the next phase, we're going to deal with winnowing. But basically, the definition of this is taking the fruit out of its shell, husk, peel, etc. And the biblically, there are two examples outside of the wheat scenario, which are pure dash, that there's just no way to do them. One is squeezing grapes, and the other one is pressing olives. Those are the two biblically um, prohibited ones. Now, there are other fruits that we squeeze. Give me examples of other fruits that you might squeeze.
Lemon.
Orange, good. Oranges, lemons, limes, right? Those are sort of squeezing fruits. Those fruits are not going to be, those are only rabbinically going to be dash. And you can see over here, he's got sort of the juicer, and see it's got that rabbi sign, the scroll sign, that this is prohibited. Now, this is a very subtle picture because you're actually allowed, you'll see this over here, the permissible hand with this cute little red-haired yeshiva student squeezing lemon onto his fish. Now, the idea of dash, I think the way you might conceptualize it is true when you're going to squeeze something out to collect it in its pure form. The areas where that is the case are going to be things like when you squeeze juice for juice's sake. However, when you are going to squeeze a lemon as if it was a condiment onto a salad, and there are a number of different salads besides fish, where else might you squeeze a lemon?
A
Yeah.
salad.
Okay, good. So you're squeezing lemon onto a salad green. Permissible. You're allowed to do that. And even let's say you want to make lemonade. How are you going to do that? That lemon juice is part of lemonade. So the answer is if you squeeze the lemon onto the sugar, sugar is solid. So you're allowed to make it by squeezing the lemon onto the sugar and then putting that mixture into water. This is quite a subtle thing, but it's sort of this is exactly how the rabbis work. That they have very strict operational definitions on this. Now, one of the most surprising examples of this is the reason they put the cow there is because they wanted it to be a very PG book, right? Now, um, I'm curious, how many of the good assembled Jews on this call have ever milked a cow?
I have.
Okay, I got one,
I have two.
two. All right, we got. Let's see how many people on here. Out of 25 people, we were doing, I guess, 4% of the people um, have have milked a cow. Okay. Now, I'm one of the 25, so maybe I'm five. Maybe maybe we're up to 5%, 6% of the people have milked a cow. However, it is quite common these days for nursing women to express milk, especially, if you are a woman who, goes back to work relatively soon after you've had a child, so you're going to express milk, and maybe freeze it. Maybe, you feed the baby with a bottle. Very, very common kind of a thing. As counterintuitive as it may seem, and made difficult as it may seem, a woman is not allowed to express milk on Shabbat and collect it. Now, there are two things I want to point out here. Number one is that sometimes it can be very painful not to do so. I can't say that from experience, but of the understanding that that's the case. In that case, a woman is allowed to relieve pressure. She's allowed to pump, but she needs to pump in a way that the resultant product is not going to be usable. So this is just another example of some of these malachot are only violated if they're effective. There's a general concept which actually they point out here at the beginning here. It's called Melechet Machshevet. So I think it's on one of the, see if I can figure out what page it's on for you. Jonathan, it's the white page, right? So this idea of, and starts at the very top of the page, it says Meleches Machsheves. It's not the very first, but it's in amongst the first pages. So Meleches Machsheves means that it's an act of craftsmanship, perhaps an expert act. It means that this act is done in a way, that's the page. It's done in a way where it has the correct result. So if you're doing something, even if the action, even if the physics of it are identical, the physics of expressing milk for a baby in one of these devices is exactly the same if it's an empty bottle at the bottom or you put a little, let's say, dish soap at the bottom. Because if you put dish soap in the bottom, no one's drinking it because it tastes horrible, right? Those two are identical acts from a physical perspective. But the rules of Shabbat is that if it is done um, in a certain way, that it's going to be melechet machshevet, it's going to be significant work. But if it's done in a way which does not result, we have two examples of that already today. One is when you spill water from your raincoat or your hat onto a puddle. That's not considered watering the ground because it's already wet, because we're looking at the result. And the second one is if you are expressing milk into a scenario where the milk is going to be inedible in the end. So that would be the second example of this. Now,
Rabbi,
yes.
if a farmer had to milk his cow because there was nobody else, you just spill that milk?
Ah, so this was a very serious question in the early days of the state of Israel, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a famous tshuva of Rabbi Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook, where he says the um, that the Israel needs to have non-Jews in the country. this idea that Israel would need to be a country of only Jews he says is not realistic because we will there is I think he used this as a sign of the reason that we need to have some kind of partnership relationship with other groups, with other ethnic groups within the land of Israel, is that we will need people to milk the cows. It is generally not the case I guess in the modern world that a Jew will have an individual cow. Um, and I don't. There are some leniencies for what's called tsar ba'alei chaim, for not needlessly painting an animal. I am not sure if there is license to milk a cow on your own. If you had to do that, I would say that it follows the same procedure as mother's milk, right? Which is um, which is that you're going to put something in the bucket that renders the milk not edible, and then you could relieve the cow without having violated the prohibition. Okay, now here's another one that had I been in charge of writing this, I would not have seen this, but nevertheless. This is something that the rabbis understood as it's called a tolada. A tolada means a derivative of the law, but the derivative does not make it rabbinic in nature. It makes it still biblical in nature. And that is wringing out something absorbed into a tablecloth. And so I believe the cloth has to be natural. That's number one. And number two is there's a real definition to this. The definition to this is how wet is it? And there's a special definition of wetness, which is tofeach al manat latpiach, which means that if you were to touch the tablecloth or the towel, and then you were to touch something else, would that second surface be wet? And if it is that, if that's the level of wetness, then you have a problem. This led to an enormous controversy with one of the most wonderful inventions of the 20th century, the baby wipe. Okay? Because let's just for a moment discuss the technology of the baby wipe. And there are now adult versions of these, and there's also like what is it called? It's like the Lysol disinfecting. You get those like individual sheets. Well, yeah, but like it's for like wiping off your kitchen counter, right? A disinfecting wipe. Now those are a problem also because you have to rip them. We haven't gotten to ripping yet. But what about let's just deal with your basic baby wipe or your adult wipe. I give the flushable wipes that you can now buy. So there is a lot of controversy about them, and certainly there are still rabbis who say that is exactly this problem. The whole point of that piece of cloth is to be able to deliver moisture and a wiping surface at the same time. And so if you're literally doing that, you're literally wringing it out on some level so that the moisture hits the surface that you're trying to clean and then dissolves the dirt or whatever it is that you're trying to remove, and then takes it away with the cloth. It looks like he's wringing it out to be able to collect it, but this is would be a rabbinic prohibition at a minimum anytime that you are squeezing water out. However, very prominent posek in Israel, Rabbi Asher Weiss, said that he went and investigated this thing very, very thoroughly. And these flushable wipes, the baby wipes, they are not made of cotton. They are not made of wool. They're not made of paper. They're not really paper towels. They are made of a synthetic fiber. And this synthetic fiber is actually quite interesting. The liquid is actually not absorbed into the fiber and then you press it out, but rather it is specifically designed so the liquid sits as a coating on top of it. And so Rabbi Weiss's position is that those things are actually kosher on Shabbat. But this is one of those things where you have to kind of know the science and the halacha and put them together. Okay, excellent question. Can women breastfeed on Shabbat? What about the use of breast pumps to expel milk? Okay, so yes, women can breastfeed on Shabbat. No problem with that whatsoever. Um, the 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 use of breast pumps is exactly the problem. You cannot express the milk on Shabbat. If you are expressing milk on Shabbat, it needs to be rendered undrinkable. But um, certainly you are allowed to feed the baby. Now, I know exactly what the next question is. What's the next question? What's the next question? Somebody say it. No one wants to ask the question? What happens when you have a baby on Shabbat and the baby, thank God, the baby took Enfamil from the bottle. But sometimes babies are funny, right? Sometimes they don't nurse perfectly. I mean, I'm maybe not the most experienced parent on this, and I'm certainly not the most experienced breastfeeder on the in the collected world here. But I do know that this is something that happens, and there's all sorts of things that can go on that might complicate that. Generally speaking, there is if if we are really in a situation where the child will not eat anything else, and the child is also in danger, and we do not try to it's not one of these things that we quantify very rigorously. Here we're sort of talking about the issue of what we'll call pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh is saving a life on Shabbat. Now, saving a life on Shabbat is that we say that you're allowed to violate the Shabbat in order to save a life on Shabbat. There are a couple of things to know about this particular law. The first thing to know about this particular law is that we do not violate Shabbos to save a life. Rabbi, I thought you just said we violate Shabbos to save a life. That is not true. We violate Shabbos if we might have to save a life. What does that mean? It means, I'm going to use the Hebrew term. The Hebrew term is we violate Shabbat on safek pikuach nefesh. Safek means we're in doubt. We don't know if we're saving a life or if we're not. If someone were to come in and say, let's say we have a 75-year-old overweight smoker individual who just had too much cholent at the Shabbos Kiddush and is starting to feel chest pain. We don't know if it is indigestion or angina. Well, we're not sticking around to find out. We don't give Tums and call the doctor later, right? We say, okay, we've got a differential diagnosis here. It could be life-threatening, could be not life-threatening. Go. Another good example of that is like there's a kind of a cough which is called croup, right? And what the doctors tell you to do is like you're supposed to go into a warm shower and it should clear up, right? But sometimes you you don't know, and you have got a 4-year-old who's suffering from this kind of cough. Do you wait and you say, is this really the life-threatening version, or is this just something that's going to pass? Answer is, go to the hospital, drive, because this is something you don't know the outcome. So you're going to violate Shabbat. You're going to violate Shabbat. Now, again, let's apply it to our nursing case. The nursing case is we don't know if this child is in a life-threatening situation. Now, I can tell you pretty much with great certainty that a child that misses one feeding is not in a life-threatening situation. But again, I'm a rabbi, not a doctor. So, again, every child is different. Every scenario is different. There are different conditions that children might be in. There's fever. There's how long they haven't eaten. Lots of different things. So if it is a question of, okay, this child is not eating and we are really nervous about this scenario and feeding is absolutely critical. So we would say violate Shabbat, express the milk if that's the way to feed the child and the child is in a life-threatening situation. Now you have to use it somewhat honestly. You cannot say, okay, it's everything's life-threatening. Life is terminal, right? So you have to be honest about it, but if there was an absolute necessity and we knew that it was a life-threatening scenario, we would allow for that kind of um, a leniency. One of the arguments for this, by the way, is that the Torah says about the mitzvot that you were meant to live by them. So this idea of living by the mitzvot is applied to Shabbat in the following way. We say, look, it is better that you violate this Shabbat, and then you are able to celebrate all subsequent Shabbatot. That is the goal. And so this idea of violating Shabbat is to, in a way, you are violating Shabbat in order to enhance Shabbat. That is the argument that is developed in this particular scenario. Okay. So that is um, um, I guess the question in nursing. Okay. I think that was the second point I wanted to make. The first point I wanted to make is we violate Shabbat on safek pikuach nefesh, on the potential that we're saving a life, not the certainty that we're saving a life. And the other is that we violate Shabbat in order to preserve for future Shabbatot for this individual. So hopefully, anyway, that creates a little bit of clarity about that thing. Just one other interesting halacha. I don't know if I mentioned it in a different class, so I think I'm safe of not repeating myself. So let's say, God forbid, you're in a situation where your child you need to go to the hospital on Shabbat. So there are two ways to get to the hospital, generally speaking. You can call an ambulance, and then everybody knows why you're in an ambulance. You don't need to do anything special there. If they see, somebody very religious riding in an ambulance on Shabbat, they're like, oh my gosh, oh, I hope they're okay. I know they're not violating Shabbat. But what if God forbid, you have to go to the hospital on Shabbat, you have to drive someone to the hospital on Shabbat, um, and then all of a sudden somebody sees Rabbi Rosenblatt driving down Oak Street on Shabbat. That's could be a problem, right? So the advice I saw in one contemporary Torah book was wear a tallis. Because then you're like, wait a minute, that's so strange. I saw Rabbi Rosenblatt driving in a tallis on Shabbos. And then you're going to say something must be up. I don't know what it is, but something must be up. So that was sort of the advice of that particular sefer. I thought it was good. I think it was actually a book about like about the halachot of childbirth and things like that. And childbirth, by the way, is considered a life-threatening scenario, right? Because in the days of the Talmud, right, one of the most common.
Hey, Steve.
Sorry?
How's it going? Good. Did you wake up?
Oh, sorry. I think we're.
Okay. Yeah. No, I thought you would have slept all Sunday.
Um, so, the childbirth, as evidenced by the birth of Benjamin, for example, the birth of Benjamin results in the death of Yaakov's wife Rachel, and so it was a very dangerous thing. And so this book was talking about, well, what if a husband has to drive his wife to the hospital on Shabbat? So that was the recommendation, is that he should drive in a talus. So that's I guess an interesting piece of the puzzle. So, okay, any other questions on these malachot that we've been working through? No, nothing, eh? All right. Well, then in a few minutes we're going to get into Parsha Shavua. Yeah. Sorry, I heard a question.
Oh, I had a question.
Go for it.
So if on Shabbat, thank you, we use self-driving cars, is that allowed? And also, if you ask a friend to drive you on Shabbos, like, is that allowed?
Okay, so the issue of those are really two separate issues. One issue is automatic devices on Shabbat, and the second issue is a non-Jew doing work for you on Shabbat. So each one of those has its own kind of scenario. The automatic devices are in principle allowed on Shabbat. You might say to yourself, wait a minute, what kind of automatic devices did they have in the days of the Talmud? I'll tell you what kind of automatic devices they had. They had traps, right? You were allowed, somebody who was a trapper, I don't know, whatever. They're allowed to set traps before Shabbat, and those, they work when they work. So this was a kosher form of activity. The Shulchan Aruch talks about grandfather clocks, that you're allowed to wind a grandfather clock and let it sort of run through on Shabbat. So automatic devices are allowed. However, automatic devices which carry an individual. Now right now you're talking about a self-driving car. So I think the world's most the two self-driving cars which are most likely to be encountered today are the Waymo. If you've been in Los Angeles or Phoenix or maybe Las Vegas, the only reason I know they're in Los Angeles is because I think they summoned them in those riots and like burned them up. But when I was in
Oh,
last, they have them. It's really freaky. Like these cars are like driving next to you and no one's in it. But it's basically Uber that it's operated by Google, but it's like Uber. You can summon it to you and it takes you anywhere and you can then drive it or you can have it drive you. The other one is the Tesla. It's not legal for a Tesla to self-drive to you anywhere, but it can. And so let's just work in the Tesla scenario. In order to get Tesla to drive you somewhere, I believe it has to be programmed immediately, right? So your question is, if I'm understanding correctly, if at some point Tesla has Shabbos mode, like my refrigerator, and Shabbos mode works like
sure.
this, the car will open up its doors for me automatically at 8 a.m. and it will allow me to get into it. And then it will go to shul and it will drop me off at shul at 8:45. And then it will do whatever it does, whatever Teslas do to entertain themselves for the 3 hours that we're in shul. And then it comes to pick me up after Kiddush, let's just say at 1:45. Is that going to be kosher? At the moment, I would say that the current jurisprudence on this subject is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who essentially talks about a public Uber, an automatic self-driving car, which we sometimes would call a subway train, right? Or a bus, right? He says you can't get on those because he says it looks like you're
Yeah.
violating Shabbos.
Yeah.
But I will tell you that even though there might be a strong argumentation to make and say there's no difference between a Roomba and a grandfather clock, and I don't know, we can think about the other things that work automatically in our world, and light timers and all that stuff, and a self-driving car. I will tell you that I don't think any rabbi in the world will ever put his name on a tshuva that says it's okay. Do you know why? Because I think that is a recipe for the end of Shabbat, right? Because motorized transport and Shabbat just don't live happily together. Shabbat is yeah. Go ahead.
Rabbi, sorry, I don't have my camera on. I was going to share your understudy, Rabbi Fettigren, shared, the three opinions from the conservative movement that, were that he opined were the greatest threat, and he talked about the mechitza, but the greatest one was, they originally poskin that it was okay to drive to shul, when people started to live further, and it was the worst thing that ever happened to my family, right? Because became, oh, if you can drive to shul, but then it very quickly, well, you can pick up a carton of milk or whatever the case is. So,
Right,
you
right.
know, It's
Yes, yes,
it's the driving, right?
yes, and Daniel Gordis, I think, was the one who opined about this.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I think that's very much the case. And to a certain extent, I believe I heard Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Rimon, who's a prominent rabbi in Israel, sort of in the Zionist Orthodox camp, who basically said that, it's very hard to figure out exactly why electricity is forbidden on Shabbat. But the rabbis kind of knew that if you allow interaction with electricity in a dynamic way, meaning an adjustable way, you're going to really put an end to Shabbat as we know it. Now, the second question was about asking someone to drive you. And the answer to asking someone to drive you is there's also a similar reticence, there's a similar resistance to asking a non-Jew to do something for you. Now, there is license to do that under very special circumstances, but if I may, we're gonna have a separate class all about that because it is a very challenging scenario. For those of us who were in shul, was it 2 weeks ago, when Ido Aroni was here, and the lights went out all of a sudden, and we got the custodian to light it. So there is, just so everyone knows, there is one specific permission for what's called tzarchei rabim, for the needs of the community as a whole. So when we have maintenance staff here in the shul, security staff, and things like that, they are allowed to do certain things. Adjust the temperature controls. Would be an example. Maybe turn on lights when we can't function, because those are the needs of the entire community. So that's a little bit different. Another good example of that, by the way, is in Israel, the water company and the power company, it's a Jewish state. So you don't want, Eliyahu Cohen managing the power plant on Shabbos, right? So, but we can't shut off the power for all of Yerushalayim for Shabbos. So that's okay.